Oh, gosh. Right. It was, again, if we're talking about, Edward VIII offers the exact illustration. When the crown was placed on his father's coffin, the orb and cross on the top fell off. Imagine if the crown slips on the king's head, or the same thing happens. That sense of augury, you know. Remember, it is hugely difficult doing this, and to do it as we are used to seeing it done. I mean, you looked at the immaculate way in which the Queen's funeral was handled. I mean, getting that coffin up the steps of the west front of St. George's Chapel. First, you've got to have 6 really strapping lads doing it, but the degree of organisation is extraordinary. Of course, all these things are now double-checked, and you did all realise, didn't you? The crown is screwed down. There are special clips on the top of the coffin, in the same way you don't trust the Lord Chamberlain to be able to break his wand of office. It's got a hinge, which seems to be. I mean, it's really so sad. I mean, the funeral ceremony of Queen Elizabeth I, you still know about it, because if you look in the vault, you can actually see the shattered staves lying on top of the coffin, and it's an extraordinary act when that happens. But I think if the crown slips, falls off, a bit falls out, you know. Maybe again, because we're in this age of woke, if the Cullinan diamond falls out of the scepter and Black Lives posters appear behind.
What is a royal peculiar? Why are Westminster Abbey, Chapel Royal, and St. George's Chapel, Windsor,
yeah, well, I think it's a pretty accurate description of them, but if you look at the clergy. But what it means is they're not subject to the jurisdiction of a bishop. So the original, when Henry secularizes Westminster Abbey, they knew they would have to do something special with it because of its role, and the original intention is there would be a special court bishop, the Bishop of Westminster, who would, I think, in time become ex officio, as it were, the principal theological advisor to the monarch and the Dean of the Chapel Royal, though that position has now gone to the Bishop of London. Heaven help us when you look at her. But instead, from Elizabeth onward, the rule develops that Westminster, the various chapel royals, I mean, now it's principally Hampton Court and St. James's and St. George's Windsor, they're directly under the control of the monarch. So the monarch appoints the dean, the monarch determines the forms of worship used there, and so on. And and again, again, remember, one of the things that's most extraordinary about the Church of England was intended to be a rigorous Calvinist church. That would have led to the destruction of all ceremony. It would have led to the destruction of choirs and everything else. And it doesn't happen because Elizabeth didn't want it to happen. And she keeps these things going. And she has people like Goodman, storing up what we regard as, forgive me, Amanda, the rags of popery. I mean, all of this stuff is kept, and it survived far enough into the 17th century to be recorded, so that even though it's destroyed in the Revolution, even though it's destroyed by the Puritans, what you do is you can reconstruct it, which you do in 1660. That's right. The question is why, and we've seen this very clearly with Charles, why does his consort, and remember we were all sold the myth, weren't we, that she was only going to have a princess consort because we didn't wish to disrespect the ghost of Diana, did we? Anyway, she's a bit forgotten now apart from Harry. Instead she's now going to be not even queen consort, she's going to be queen, because the rule was very simple in the Middle Ages, right through to Edward VIII, that the wife of a king is called the queen. If you were able to have a wife of a king who wasn't a queen, it would have been entirely unnecessary for Edward VIII to abdicate. Right. Now, the other way round, right through the Middle Ages, if you get a woman succeeding to the throne, in other words, what we would call a queen regnant, let's look at this very carefully. Countries are very aware that if the title to the monarchy goes to a woman, the risk is you're then taken over by her foreign husband. So what the French do, because in fact the proper successor to the throne of France by most views of hereditary succession was Edward III, the French invent a law called Salic law, which means no woman can inherit the throne, and moreover, nobody who is descended in the female line can inherit the throne, which is why the French monarchy constantly goes in these huge swoops from male cousin to male cousin. In England, no woman sits on the throne until the children of Henry VIII. Remember, if female succession had been possible, Lady Margaret Beaufort would have been Queen Margaret I, and because her son Henry VII dies a few weeks before her, there'd have never been a Henry VII, right? But that's not the case. The female succession is only enabled by Henry VIII. Henry VIII passes an act of parliament sustained by his will, or is it his will sustained by act of parliament, which leaves the throne in succession to his 3 children. So if Edward doesn't have children, Mary inherits. If Mary doesn't have children, Elizabeth inherits. But when Mary inherits, Philip is king. If you actually look at the title, the reign changes and it becomes the reign of Philip and Mary. And the Privy Council, even though Philip isn't in England, the Privy Council reports to him. But what the English do, they draft a treaty so cleverly that the Habsburgs can't get their hands on England unless there is an heir. If Philip and Mary had had an heir, we would have become part of the Habsburg Empire. And that again is clearly the rule that's in everybody's mind under Elizabeth. One of the reasons she is so reluctant to marry. But by the time, and then when we have the next female succession, which is the Glorious Revolution, which is Mary, William is sovereign. And then you get that although the hereditary claim is to Mary, William is the actual sovereign, and you have a double coronation in which you have to make 2 coronation chairs, 2 imperial crowns, 2 St. Edward's crowns, 2 lots of sceptres and all the rest of it, because they're co-rulers. The next female succession, you introduce the modern rule that you're referring to. Queen Anne, you make sure that her husband is merely Duke of Gloucester and is a nobody. The position which only Victoria challenges when she tries to promote against the passionate resistance of the English aristocracy, Prince Albert. And it's something, again, of course, which the Duke of Edinburgh chafed against. Again, if you're to understand Charles, he had an aggressively masculine father who felt that he'd been emasculated. And so that's the reason. And other foreign monarchies have adopted that. Again, the Danish monarchy, I mean, bizarrely, I have got to know Queen Margaret reasonably well because she's a frequent visitor to Kent. But her husband, Heinrich, who was really Henri, French aristocratic diplomat, frothed at the mouth at not being king and actually broke the marriage. He refused to be buried with her. Imagine attaching such importance to these trivial things, but then I suppose if you spend your life in evening dress and wearing a chain, it rather becomes a habit, doesn't it? Yes.
When he was still Prince of Wales, the now king said that rather than be defender of the faith, he'd like to be defender of faith. How do you think that works, and where does it leave the church?
Right. It's very interesting, isn't it? Let me now tell you what the logical implication of that is, and then we'll look at the very illogical way in which it's going to be done. I think we are at the stage of another great empire that's on its last legs, that's to say Rome. We are at our Roman stage. I've not made up my mind whether it's 410, when you've just had the first sack of Rome, or whether it's 440 and you're really going downhill and the aqueducts are going to be cut. But when everybody goes on about water supply, I think we're probably 440 and the aqueducts are going to be cut. But the most brilliant analysis of that remains Edward Gibbon. And Edward Gibbon has got something, I don't think Prince Charles is quite well read enough to have read it, but it takes us to the heart of this. Gibbon describes the attitude to religion in ancient Rome, and it goes as follows. All the philosophers thought that all religions were equally false. The people thought that all religions were equally true. The politicians thought that all religions were equally useful. Now, where does Prince Charles fall on that spectrum? Does he think they're all true? Does he think they're all useful? Do you see what I mean? Bearing in mind each one, and particularly Christianity and Islam and Judaism, make absolutely conflicting claims about universal validity. So the whole thing requires this extraordinary suspension of belief, as it were. Now, the way it's being handled is interesting. The first time that any non-Anglican element was in, and remember, the king remains bound both by the Glorious Revolution and more particularly by the Act of Settlement of 1701. The king remains absolutely bound to the Protestant religion of the Church of England as established by law. Right, that is a given. That's an absolute. And the first time that any breach in that happened was in 1953 with the coronation of the Queen, when the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland was given the task of presenting the Bible, on which the monarch is going to swear the oath to them, with, lots of things delivered in broad Scots accent about the oracle of God and all the rest of it, going along with it. What's happened this time round is something, I think, really quite clever and subtle. You've got four peers, Buddhist, Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, who are going to present bits of the regalia. Some of them quite important, some of them quite minor, like the royal glove. The three of them, it was all right. You weren't putting anybody's nose out of joint, because these had been presented simply by members of the royal household, part of the wardrobe. And that, they're given to the Lord Great Chamberlain or to the Archbishop of Canterbury to be put upon the king. The only one that actually had one of these court of claims things was the Manor of Worksop, the Lord of the Manor of Worksop, whose job it was to give the king his gloves to cover the consecrated hands. Remember, in the Middle Ages, the consecration of the hands was thought to be such and so effective that you actually had a particular royal miracle, which is the touching of the king's evil, which is scrofula. And you also had a second royal miracle, which is the blessing of cramp rings, which are intended to cure rheumatism and arthritis and whatever. And that's again done with the rubbing of the ring between fingers with the royal spittle. There will be then there'll be four peers, as I said, representing Sikh, Hindu, Islam, and Judaism, who will present bits of the regalia. In other words, they won't be doing anything formally religious. The actual putting of the bit of regalia on will be done by the Archbishop of Canterbury, as always done. It's a quite ingenious compromise. But then, when the king turns up in a Sikh temple and sort of wears all the bits and pieces, it is the problem, when you've gone around the empire and you've worn hula hoops and skirts and, whatever, presumably they all become more or less much of a muchness. Nobody can have been photographed in more silly outfits than King Charles, including Justin Trudeau. It really is it's a pretty hot competition, isn't it? You can see. Now, I hope you can see. I think clearly nobody in their right mind would devise constitutional monarchy. On the other hand, it works. But equally, it's not something I believe we should fawn over. There should be a degree of respect on the one hand, but a sense of the absurdity of it on the other. But also an awareness, ladies and gentlemen, that life isn't just about reason. Reason is only one of our human faculties. And I don't think it's by any means the most important.
Last question.
No, it's not a question. Just a little music in the monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That series is available on YouTube. I've just watched it all again. It was just
Isn't it wonderful? But thank you for saying that. I mean, it was one of the series that I most enjoyed making. It arose directly out of, it actually happened at the royal reception for my for the royal opening of my Henry VIII exhibition at the British Library in 2009, when I talked about Henry's own interest in music. That was a day of very mixed feelings for me. That was also the day in which my late partner, who finally died of alcoholism, was arrested for drink driving, and I then had to perform. It was a very good test. A very good test. But that series is wonderful. I enjoyed doing it, and it's only I've only done two or three things for the BBC. Mainly I was Channel 4 and whatever. But that series, the BBC, it was the old BBC, the BBC that recognised that you had to spend. You know, we had the greatest orchestras, we had the finest choirs, the music in St Paul's. They used 54 microphones. Because the dome is impossible to record under. Again, the camera work, Chris Openshaw, most wonderful cameraman. The camera work, I think, in what's it called, in King's College Chapel is astonishing, because they're singing this piece of very, very elaborate polyphony. And I compare it to the way in which the ribs of the vault work. And Chris was able to move the camera so that it's synchronized. I mean, if you can make word and image come together in television like that, it does. I mean, at the risk of I've been sending up everybody else's potential, so I'll finish off by being pretentious myself and able to be sent up. It really does turn it into an art form. Thank you.
Please thank David Starkey.